The studio lights burned brighter than usual, almost as if they had been turned up deliberately to set the stage for a clash. Jon Stewart sat in his chair with that half-smirk millions recognized from his years behind the desk, the kind of expression that told the audience he was about to humiliate someone with a punchline. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt sat upright, calm but visibly ready. She knew Stewart's reputation, a master of snark, a man who thrived on making his opponents look foolish in front of a laughing crowd. But this time was different. This wasn't a passive guest walking into a comedian's arena. Karoline had prepared for every angle, every sarcastic jab, every trick Stewart could pull. From the very start, Stewart tried to frame the narrative. "Karoline," he began, his voice dripping with irony, "you've become the poster child of a movement that confuses stubbornness with intelligence. Tell me, do you actually believe the things you say, or do you just rehearse them in the mirror until they sound convincing?" The audience erupted with laughter, exactly the reaction he wanted. The smirk widened. He leaned back, satisfied that he had already scored the opening point. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't force a nervous smile, and she didn't lower her eyes like so many guests had done before. Instead, she let the laughter fade until the room quieted just enough for her words to cut through. "Jon," she said, her tone steady but sharp, "you've made a career out of mocking people who actually fight for something real. But here's the thing, mockery doesn't change facts, and your jokes won't erase the truth I'm about to lay down." For the first time, Stewart's grin tightened. The audience sensed the shift. They weren't watching another routine where he played executioner with clever punchlines. They were watching a showdown. Karoline's presence had flipped the script, and suddenly, it was Jon Stewart who looked like he had something to prove. Stewart pivoted to the control wall with a flick of his wrist, classic tempo shift. "Roll the tape," he said, and the screens behind him lit up with a snappy montage cut like a roast, 3-second clips of Karoline at rallies, a freeze frame of her mid-blink, a clipped quote with a punchline baked into the edit. The audience laughed on cue. It was the old arsenal, editing as a weapon, context as a casualty. Stewart glanced back at her, basking in the reaction. "See," he said, eyebrows arched, "performance over policy. Great hits, not much substance." Karoline kept her eyes on the screen until the lights dimmed. Then she leaned forward, elbows off the table, posture like a trial lawyer about to dismantle testimony. "Jon," she said evenly, "you just broadcast a TikTok in a suit. Let's slow it down." She turned her palm upward toward the crowd. Clip 1 was from a town hall about border tech. The sentence after your edit was the budget line and the procurement timeline. Clip 2 was a jobs presser, what you cut out was the wage ladder by quarter. Clip 3? A student Q&A where I talked about fentanyl data sources. You trimmed the sources and kept the smirk. A hum moved through the audience, the first hairline fracture in the laughter. Stewart tried to keep it playful. "Okay, alright, context queen. But isn't the vibe still the same? You say a lot, fast, and hope people don't notice the holes." She smiled, small, unhurried. "Or I speak clearly and quickly because families don't have time for 5 commercial breaks between facts." She tapped the table with 2 fingers, a metronome. "Here are 3, overdose deaths spiked from synthetics crossing gaps in surveillance, small manufacturers can't hire because their insurance costs outpaced revenue, and federal procurement still treats software like a stapler. Those aren't vibes. Those are real people's bills." Stewart's smirk faltered a millimeter, barely visible unless you were watching for it. He threw a lifeline to the safety of mockery. "So you've got talking points laminated. Impressive." "Receipts," she corrected, sliding a thin folder toward him. Inside were printed charts, timestamps, and QR codes to full speeches. "You make jokes. I make paper trails." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. "And by the way, when comedians trim context, it's craft. When politicians do it, you call it spin. Which one are you tonight?" Applause bubbled up, not a tidal wave, but crisp and intentional. Stewart blinked, then tried a new angle, lowering his tone as if offering mercy. "Look, Karoline, I'm not saying you're not smart. I'm saying you've hitched yourself to a brand that thrives on outrage. Isn't that convenient? She tilted her head. Convenient is editing a person into a punchline and sending everyone home satisfied. Hard is staying for the policy after the laugh. She gestured toward the crowd again. You all came for comedy, you might leave with homework. That's a win in my book. He laced his fingers, leaning in. So you're the serious adult in the room? I'm the person in the room who knows punchlines don't pay rent. The line landed like a clean right cross, no shout, no flourish, just wait. And if we're measuring seriousness, let's measure outcomes, fewer overdoses, more hires, faster permitting. If I sound urgent, it's because people are running out of time while we're running out the clock. For a breath, the studio felt like a courtroom at closing argument, airtight, no oxygen for snark. Stewart glanced at the monitor, then back at Karoline, weighing whether to escalate or retreat. He chose escalation. All right then, he said, palms open, let's go policy for policy, no montage, no applause signs. You game? Karoline nodded once. Always. She folded her hands, steady, centered. But if we're doing substance, we do the whole thing. No edits, no giggles to bail you out. Somewhere in the second row, a laugh slipped out, nervous, appreciative, maybe both. The bandleader traded a look with a camera op, the switcher hesitated on a close-up, unsure whose face told the better story, the comedian meeting resistance, or the guest refusing to shrink. Stewart gestured to the producer. Lights up. Let's have the grown-up table. Karoline beat him to the first topic. Border tech acquisition, why are we still buying yesterday's hardware at tomorrow's prices? She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The role reversal was complete, Stewart's stage, Karoline's terms. And the audience, sensing it, leaned in. The producer gave a reluctant nod, and the studio screens went black. No more montages, no clever edits. Just Karoline and Stewart, table between them, lights sharp and merciless. Stewart licked his lips, as if bracing himself, then leaned forward. Fine, he said. Let's start with border policy. Everyone loves to scream about it, but you know as well as I do, it's a logistical nightmare. Isn't your side just throwing slogans at an unsolvable problem? Karoline didn't flinch. John, the only slogan I heard tonight was yours. You call it unsolvable because it's easier to laugh than to roll up your sleeves. But let's break it down. We've got surveillance gaps the size of counties, outdated procurement laws that treat drones like paperweights, and a court backlog that leaves families in limbo for years. Those aren't mysteries. Those are choke points. Stewart tried the old pivot, raise an eyebrow, inject sarcasm. So your answer is, what? Build a bigger wall and hope it comes with Wi-Fi? The crowd laughed, but thinner this time, not the tidal wave he usually commanded. Karoline leaned in, her tone measured but sharp. Not a wall, John. A network. AI-assisted scanning that flags synthetic fentanyl before it crosses. Smart contracts that force accountability when contractors overbill the government. Legal triage so legitimate asylum seekers aren't buried under fake claims. That's not Wi-Fi. That's infrastructure. The silence was different now. The laughter didn't drown her out, it stalled, turned uneasy. Stewart tapped his pen against the table, the rhythm betraying nerves. Okay, but you throw around AI and smart contracts like tech buzzwords. Isn't that just Silicon Valley vaporware dressed up as policy? Karoline smiled, not the polite smile of a guest, but the grin of someone who had set a trap and watched it spring. Funny you say that. Because I've actually piloted one of those systems in New Hampshire. It cut wait times by 40%. Real families, real results. But sure, let's call them buzzwords if that makes you comfortable. That landed heavy. Even the bandleader shifted in his seat. Stewart, trying to salvage the upper hand, shot back, all right, fine. But at the end of the day, your platform still sells outrage. Doesn't it all come down to getting people mad enough to keep you relevant? Karoline straightened her spine, her voice low but resonant. No, John. Outrage is what happens when people can't afford insulin, when their kids overdose on fentanyl, when their paychecks can't cover rent. I don't sell it. I answer to it. And if that sounds inconvenient on a comedy stage, maybe that's the point. The audience broke into applause, not nervous this time, but deliberate. Stewart's jaw tightened, his smirk struggling to survive. He looked at his notes, then back at Karoline, the next gotcha loaded but suddenly heavier in his hand. He tried again. So what, you're saying the comedian's the unserious one, and you're the only adult at the table? Karoline's eyes locked on his. I'm saying the adults are watching this right now, praying someone finally takes their problems seriously. And I won't laugh them off for ratings. For the first time that night, Stewart didn't have a comeback ready. The cameras caught it, the hesitation, the microsecond of silence that said more than a monologue ever could. The silence that lingered after Karoline's last line wasn't the kind Stewart was used to. Normally, a pause meant anticipation, a setup for his punchline, the crowd leaning in, ready to explode with laughter. But this silence was heavier. It wasn't waiting for him. It was waiting on her. That shift unsettled him, and he knew it. His smirk wavered, his pen tapped louder on the desk, and for a split second the cameras caught something he never intended to show, unease. So he tried to recover the only way he knew, by going personal. He leaned back, forced a chuckle, and shook his head like he had seen this before. You know what, Karoline? I've interviewed a lot of politicians in my time. And you all come dressed in the same armor, buzzwords, moral posturing, talking points. But the truth is, you're young. You've barely logged enough years in public life to know what this job really takes. You've got fire, sure. But fire doesn't make you credible, it makes you reckless. The crowd let out a collective gasp, part laughter, part discomfort. It was the kind of jab that wasn't meant to win applause but to wound. Stewart wanted to cut her down, to frame her as the rookie daring to lecture the veteran. It was a move straight from his old playbook, disarm the guest with mockery, undercut their gravitas with a reminder that he was the seasoned one. But Karoline didn't even blink. She sat still, her hands folded in front of her, and then leaned forward until the cameras had no choice but to tighten their focus on her face. Her voice dropped lower, calmer, every syllable sharpened with intent. Reckless, John? You call it reckless to care enough about people's lives to stand here and fight for them when everyone else is too comfortable to risk being mocked? You call it reckless to show up young and unafraid, instead of jaded and safe behind studio lights? No, John. What's reckless is treating this stage like a shield instead of a responsibility. The audience froze. Some clapped, others shifted uneasily, but no one laughed this time. The air shifted, and Stewart's face showed it. The insult hadn't landed. It had backfired, exposing him as the one reaching for cheap shots when the substance wasn't working. Karoline pressed forward, her words gathering momentum. You think experience is what gives you the right to dismiss me? Let me tell you something. There are mothers with no political resume who know more about sacrifice than half of Washington. There are veterans working night shifts who understand policy consequences better than any career pundit. Experience doesn't sit under these lights cracking jokes, it bleeds, it grinds, it survives. That's what credibility looks like. Now the applause came, not hesitant, not fragmented, but full. Loud enough to drown Stewart's attempts to cut back in. He tried raising his hand, his voice climbing an octave, but the rhythm of the moment wasn't his anymore. The control had slipped, and everyone knew it. Karoline delivered the final blow of that exchange, her tone unwavering. If being young means I still believe people deserve answers instead of punchlines, then I'll wear that like armor. And John, if being seasoned means hiding behind sarcasm when you've run out of real arguments, then maybe you're the reckless one. That line landed like a gavel. Stewart's pen stopped tapping. The camera caught his face again, but this time there was no smirk to hide behind. Just silence. The tension in the studio was now unmistakable. Stewart had tried to laugh her off, then cut her down, and each time Karoline had met him with precision that turned the room against him. His fallback, mockery, was spent, so he went for the one play guaranteed to rile up an audience: culture war. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voice laced with the dramatic gravity he used when he wanted to signal a serious moment. "Fine, Karoline. Let's stop pretending this is about policy. You and your party spend so much time stoking fear, tearing down progress, fighting culture battles instead of solving problems. Abortion bans, book bans, attacks on LGBTQ rights, don't tell me that's freedom. Tell me, Karoline, how does taking rights away from Americans make you the champion of liberty?" The audience erupted, half clapping, half booing, but loud enough to feel like chaos. Stewart leaned back with a self-satisfied smirk. He had baited her into the terrain he controlled: moral outrage. This was supposed to be his knockout punch, the clip that would trend online, painted as him cornering the young conservative with righteous fury. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She waited, patiently, for the audience noise to settle, her silence commanding the room until Stewart's smugness looked awkward instead of confident. Then she spoke, each word slow, deliberate, like she was stripping the argument to its bones. "You think it's progressive to confuse freedom with moral collapse, John? You call it liberty to let the state decide that parents don't matter? To put pornographic books in schools, to erase biological truth, to cheer policies that leave unborn children without a chance at life? That's not progress, that's decay dressed up as compassion." The crowd stirred again, louder this time. Some booed, yes, but others clapped, and the applause wasn't scattered. It grew, bold enough to rival Stewart's fans in the room. Karoline pressed forward. "And don't twist this into rights versus no rights. Because you and I both know the real question: whose rights? The unborn child's right to live. The parent's right to protect their kid. The family's right to raise children without government overreach. You talk about liberty, but your version of it ends where everyone else's responsibilities begin." The applause surged. Stewart tried to interject, raising his hand as if he could seize back the stage, but the momentum had shifted too far. Karoline leaned in, her voice steady, unwavering. "You want to make this about culture wars? Fine. But the war you're talking about isn't between left and right, it's between people who still believe in something bigger than themselves and those who traded principle for applause lines. And I'm not here to win your applause, John. I'm here to tell the truth." The studio wasn't split anymore. For the first time in the interview, the majority of the audience clapped for her, and kept clapping. Stewart froze, pen in hand, lips pursed. The clip moment he had been fishing for had slipped away, replaced by one he hadn't planned for at all. Jon Stewart sat frozen for just a second too long, his usual rhythm fractured. He wasn't used to silence cutting him down, it was usually his tool. The audience had shifted, and Karoline had made it clear she wasn't just holding her ground, she was winning it. His eyes darted toward the producers offstage, then back to Karoline. He needed to claw back control, and fast. So he went for the same old trick that had saved him countless times before: mockery. He leaned forward, chuckling in that sharp, dismissive way he used when he wanted to shrink a guest. "Wow," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got all the talking points down, don't you? Not bad for someone who's barely out of college. But tell me, do you even understand the complexities of governance, or are you just repeating the slogans you learned in your crash course on politics?" The laughter he expected from the audience didn't come. A few chuckles, sure, but they felt strained, almost forced. The rest of the room sat in that tense hush, eyes flicking to Karoline, waiting to see how she would respond. Karoline's face didn't flinch. She didn't look rattled or defensive. Instead, she let him finish, tilted her head just slightly, and then gave a small, measured smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement, it was the kind that said I see exactly what you're doing, and I'm about to dismantle it. John, she began, her voice calm but cutting, it's funny you call my points slogans, because I've noticed something. Every time I challenge you with facts, you run out of arguments and fall back on two things, sarcasm and age jokes. You don't actually refute me, you just try to make me look small. The crowd erupted, not with boos or mixed noise this time, but with loud, rolling applause. Stewart opened his mouth, but Karoline leaned in, riding the wave of momentum. And let me tell you something, she continued, her tone sharpening, my age doesn't make me less qualified to speak the truth. If anything, it makes me more dangerous to people like you, because it shows a whole new generation is done buying the spin. You want to laugh at me, fine. But the reality is, John, you're the one choking on your own words, not me. The applause doubled, the studio practically shaking. Even the camera operators leaned in, knowing they were capturing the moment that would be replayed across every feed, every clip, every corner of the internet. John tried to counter, but the noise swallowed him. The audience had made their choice, and Karoline had turned his favorite weapon against him. Jon Stewart's smirk faltered. He leaned back in his chair, shuffling his note cards like they might somehow rescue him. The audience had already shifted in Karoline's favor, and he knew it. But in his mind, there was still one play left, drag her into the weeds of policy, bury her under a pile of statistics and half-remembered arguments, and hope she fumbled. All right then, he said, his voice sharper now, masking his unease with a forced laugh. Let's get into specifics. You talk about securing the border, cutting wasteful spending, protecting freedom, those are nice slogans. But tell me, Karoline, exactly how do you propose balancing the budget without raising taxes? Exactly how do you propose handling immigration without tearing apart families or tanking the economy? It was his attempt to pin her down, to trap her with questions designed to make her stumble. The studio lights bore down, and the tension was palpable. Viewers at home would have leaned forward, expecting the young Republican to finally trip up. But Karoline didn't blink. She straightened her posture, locked eyes with Stewart, and answered with a clarity that stunned the room. First of all, she began, her tone steady but edged with fire, it's not a slogan to say we should stop wasting taxpayer dollars. It's reality. If you think it's impossible to balance a budget without squeezing working families, maybe you should ask why billions keep flowing to bloated bureaucracies and foreign governments while Americans can't afford groceries. The math isn't complicated, it's about priorities. And you and your friends in the media never want to admit that. The audience clapped, louder now, more confident. Stewart shifted uncomfortably. As for immigration, she continued, her voice rising just enough to cut through the murmur, I'll tell you what's really tearing families apart, open borders. It's drugs flooding our towns, it's crime destroying communities, it's cartels exploiting women and children. Securing the border doesn't kill compassion, it saves lives. But you wouldn't know that, because you and the elites you defend never face those consequences. Regular Americans do. The studio erupted again, the clapping turning into cheers. Karoline didn't stop. You ask for specifics? Here they are, cut the waste, enforce the laws we already have, and start putting Americans before the political games you like to laugh about. That's not just a plan, that's common sense. By the time she finished, the energy in the room had flipped entirely. Jon Stewart, usually the master of the takedown, was left clutching his cards like a lifeline, unable to wedge in a comeback. The audience wasn't laughing with him anymore, they were hanging on her every word. Jon Stewart's laugh cracked the silence, but it wasn't the confident, smooth laugh audiences knew him for. It was nervous, forced. His eyes darted toward the cameras as if begging them to swing the momentum back to his side. He raised his hand in mock applause, hoping sarcasm would rescue him where arguments had failed. Oh, bravo, Stewart said, pacing his words slowly. You've got the talking points down pat. Immigration equals drugs, spending equals waste, and everything is the fault of, he waved his hands dramatically, the elites. Same old lines. You don't think the American people deserve more than clichés? The audience chuckled weakly at first, but it wasn't the wave of laughter he'd counted on. Karoline sat still, her face locked in a calm defiance, almost daring him to keep going. She let the silence stretch just long enough for him to lose his rhythm, and then she struck. "John, you're calling reality a cliché because you've never lived it," she said, her tone sharp but deliberate. "You sit behind this desk, wrapped in applause, mocking the people who actually live with the failures of policies you defend. You can't joke away the fentanyl-killing teenagers. You can't mock away the taxes crushing families. And you sure can't laugh off the fact that elites like you are always insulated from the chaos you pretend doesn't exist." The crowd roared, louder now, their cheers echoing through the studio. Stewart's smirk collapsed completely. Karoline leaned forward, her voice lowering, every word deliberate. "You want to know what's tired, John? The act. The endless sneering from people who think comedy is a substitute for truth. It's easy to sit there and call the voices of millions of Americans talking points. What's hard is looking those people in the eye, the parents who lost a child to an overdose, the farmers bankrupted by bad policy, and telling them their pain is just a punchline." The audience erupted again, some on their feet, clapping, shouting in approval. The camera tried to cut to Stewart for a reaction, but his expression said it all. For the first time, he was the one cornered, fumbling for a response. Karoline didn't flinch. She ended her statement with a line that sent chills through the room. "You think you're humiliating me, John? No. Tonight, you just proved to the country that your comedy isn't sharp anymore, it's hollow. And America's tired of hollow." The studio shook with applause. Stewart opened his mouth, then closed it again, gripping his note card so hard the edges crumpled. For once, the man who always had the last laugh had no laugh at all. Jon Stewart, scrambling to salvage his ground, leaned forward with that familiar grin he used whenever he was about to land what he thought would be a clever knockout blow. His voice dripped with condescension as he cut her off mid-sentence. "Karoline, you're young, you're fiery, I'll give you that. But you don't actually know how the system works. You're out here throwing accusations, but policy isn't a tweet, it's complicated. Maybe take a few more years to learn before lecturing the grown-ups, huh?" The audience gasped. Some laughed nervously, others booed. It was classic Stewart, patronizing, trying to reduce her to inexperience, to paint her as a reckless outsider out of her depth. He leaned back smugly, convinced the applause would tilt back toward him. But Karoline didn't blink. She stared straight at him, lips curling into the faintest smirk, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "John, the difference between you and me is simple. You talk about the system, I've lived it. And unlike you, I'm not here to protect the comfort of elites, I'm here to expose them." The audience broke into cheers. Stewart's smug grin faltered, but she wasn't finished. She leaned in, her voice sharp and commanding, each word echoing in the studio. "You think I don't know how the system works? I know it all too well. The system is designed to fail regular Americans while guys like you laugh from the sidelines. You dismiss me as too young, too fiery, fine. But you know what? That's exactly why I'm dangerous to people like you. Because I'm not jaded, I'm not bought, and I'm not afraid to say out loud what you've spent your career mocking into silence." The crowd erupted, not polite clapping, but stomping, roaring, chanting. The cameras shook as the energy in the room flipped against Stewart. He shuffled his papers, trying to find his rhythm, but the noise drowned him out. Karoline raised her hand slightly, calming the room with a confidence that wasn't rehearsed, but natural. Then she delivered the line that would dominate headlines the next morning. "You built a career making Americans laugh at their own pain, John. I'm building mine making sure they never have to beg for a voice again. And that's the difference. You punch down. I punch back. The studio exploded. Stewart froze, his mouth open, unable to respond. For the first time in years, the king of political satire had been dethroned, live, and in front of his own audience. Jon Stewart, visibly rattled, shifted in his chair. His trademark wit, usually quick, sharp, untouchable, sputtered like a candle in the wind. He glanced at the audience, searching for validation, but the thunderous applause Karoline had just commanded left him stranded. Still, desperation forced him to try one last jab. "Well, Karoline," he said, forcing a chuckle, "if passion alone could fix America, maybe you'd have a shot. But it takes more than speeches, it takes leadership, compromise, understanding. You can shout at me all night, but shouting doesn't solve anything." It was weak, and everyone in the room knew it. His words didn't land, they hung in the air like smoke. Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, her voice calm, steady, with the unmistakable clarity of someone who had just won the room. "Jon, don't confuse volume with truth. I'm not here to shout. I'm here to say what millions are too afraid to say, that our leaders have failed, our institutions are broken, and our media has turned their suffering into late-night punchlines. If you think that's just passion, then you've already admitted the problem, you've stopped listening to the people you claim to represent." The audience erupted again, louder than before. Stewart tried to mask his unease, but his eyes darted, his composure slipping. Karoline raised her hand, not to silence the crowd, but to punctuate her victory. She leaned into the microphone, her voice almost a whisper, yet carrying through the entire studio with searing power. "You call it shouting. I call it refusing to be silenced. And tonight, the American people heard me loud and clear. You can mock me, you can dismiss me, but you'll never erase me. Not now. Not ever." The roar that followed was deafening. Stewart sat frozen, lips parted but no words forming. The camera zoomed in on his stunned face, then on Karoline, standing tall, her expression unshaken, resolute. For once, Jon Stewart had no punchline. He had been stripped of his greatest weapon, his words, and Karoline had turned them back on him until they choked him in silence. The headline the next morning captured it perfectly. Stewart tried to humiliate Karoline, she made him choke on his own words. And in that single night, the balance of power had shifted, not just in the studio, but in the national conversation.